Hello everyone and welcome to round number 4 of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament in Wijk aan Zee, the Netherlands. In this video we'll have a look at the game between Mamedyarov and jan-krzysztof Duda. So Shahryar was on 50%, Duda on +1, but anyway, let's have a look at what's going to happen in this game. So Shahryar opens up the game with 1 d4, knight f6, c4 and e6. So Duda is ready to play in Nimzo and Shahryar avoids with the move knight f3, d5, knight c3. So here basic queen's gambit declined. Black has many options here. He can play c6 going into the semi-Slav. Bishop b4 is called the Ragozin. This is called the Lasker, I believe. But Duda chooses the move c5. And this is called the Tarrasch. And sometimes the semi-Tarrasch, depending on what black does. So anyway, Mamedyarov takes on d5. Here black has some options. The main Tarrasch is if you take with the pawn. But here white is generally a little bit better because white starts playing against these pawns in the center. There's also knight takes d5, and this is called the semi-Tarrasch. And generally black trades off some pieces here. White gets a big center, but black is very solid. Right? This position often arises and with a lot of options for both sides. Anyway, what Duda does is another trendy line. He takes on d4 first. So he's luring the queen out of d4, and now he takes on d5. So he wants to go knight c6 on the next move and develop with a tempo, right, to hit the queen. Shahryar goes e4, striking in the center. Now if black goes knight c6, that can be comfortably met with bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king. Alright, so Duda, I knew that was going to happen, takes on e4, Shaq trades on d8 and goes knight to g5, hitting the pawn on f7 and the pawn on e4. So white is temporarily down a pawn, but black has lost the right to castle. Anyway, Duda goes bishop to e6, so he's defending the pawn and he's developing a piece, so that looks great, right? Well, the only disadvantage is that this allows white to take and ruin black's pawn structure. Besides, white also has the two bishops, so if white can stabilize here, get the pawn back, white should be a lot better, but things are not that easy. Anyway, Shahryar went bishop g5, pinning the knight. Duda goes h6, queenside castling with check, and Duda goes king to e7. And here Shahryar could have decided to keep the bishop, but here black can break the pin, and black is still up a pawn. Right, still white has to try to get this pawn back, and that's not that easy. So Mamedyarov just trades on f6, Duda recaptures, and Shaq takes on e4. So now materials equal, and black's king is a little bit unsafe. If white is fast, can go like bishop c4, rook h1, that king can get in a lot of trouble. But Duda goes f5, kicking the knight. Now he's also ready to develop the bishop, so knight g3 by Shahryar. A bit of a curious decision. I mean, he has a lot of tactics here with, let's say, bishop c4, rook e1, and the knight hitting f5 or coming to h5 in some cases. But after Duda's next move, h5, the knight suddenly is lacking prospects, right? I mean, where can the knight go? Like, all these squares are covered. Anyway, so he goes bishop c4 to put pressure on the pawn. Duda goes knight to d7. And here Shahryar plays king b1, a very important move. You cannot play rook h1 right away to hit the pawn, because suddenly black goes rook c8, and your bishop is pinned to your king. Or you can take an e6, but then after king d8, you're gonna lose the bishop anyway, because after b3 comes b5, and you're just gonna be down a piece. So that's why Shahryar plays king b1 first. Duda goes knight e5, centralizing the knight and hitting the bishop. Mamedyarov goes bishop b3, keeping the pressure on the pawn, and king f6 by Duda. Now he's ready to develop his bishop to c5, for example. So Shaq goes rook h1. If white is given a move here, let's say black goes bishop c5, there's only f4, hitting the knight, and if the knight moves, you're going to lose e6, and everything is just collapsing. So that's why Duda goes rook e8, defending the pawn on e6. Shahryar goes bishop a4, hitting the rook, and Duda goes rook e7. He wants to keep defending that pawn. And here Shaq comes up with a bit of a weird move. He goes h4. I mean, it's understandable that he wants to stop h4 from black, but it would have been better to play a move like knight e2 to reroute the knight to f4 or d4, and white should still be a tiny bit better. But after h4, Duda played knight to g6, hitting the pawn, and suddenly things are getting a bit out of control for white. I mean, it's not easy to defend this pawn. Shaq goes rook to d4 to defend it, and here Duda plays a good move. He goes rook to c7. So now he's ready to develop this bishop, hit the rook, and then also this pawn on f2 would come under attack. So Shaq goes bishop to b3, hitting the pawn, but Duda goes e5. Now here Shaq should have played rook to d5, and things are not that easy for black, because there's a lot of pressure on these pawns over here. If black plays a move like bishop c5, suddenly there's f4, pressuring the pawn on e5, and if you take with the knight, white's going to take the pawn here, and f5 is going to drop, the king is going to feel the heat, and suddenly everything is loose in the black position. And if you take an f4 with the pawn, there's rook takes f5, and knight takes h5, and suddenly the black position is collapsing as well. So rook d5 would have been a better move, once again to pressure his pawns, but Shahryar played rook to d8. And now Duda was like, hey, give me that pawn. He's also hitting this, and show me the compensation, buddy. So Shaq went rook to e8, hitting the pawn on e5, and Duda just went back. He's like, okay, I'm up a pawn, show me the compensation. If white doesn't do anything, black, like let's say white goes a3, black's just gonna go h4, kick the knight. If the knight moves, then someone like bishop g7, trade of white's active rook, and black is up a pawn in this endgame, and he has very good winning chances. So Shahryar realizes that he has to try to create some tricks here. That's why he goes rook e6 check, forcing the king to g5 and bishop c2, hitting the pawn on f5. But Duda here finds a very nice way to solve his problems. Tactically, he goes h4. So now this pawn, this knight on g3 is under attack. And what can white do about it? If white takes a pawn on f5 with the knight, there's suddenly a rook takes c2, removing the defender. And if white takes, black's going to take. And almost always the two minor pieces are better than the rook, and this is no different. Black is just completely winning. And if white takes with the bishop, then there's h takes g3. Now your bishop is under attack, so you have to take the knight with the bishop, but after pawn takes f2, this pawn on f2 is just way too strong. And after, let's say, rook f1, black can always go somewhere like bishop to c5, plant the bishop on d4, and black is just winning. So Shahryar knows he's on the edge. I mean, if he moves the knight, this is also not good. Black can just develop with a tempo once again. He's up a pawn, and his pieces are very active, and white is just borderline lost here. So Shaq, in an attempt to complicate, goes rook to e3. Okay. Now if you take the knight, he's going to take with the rook, check your king, and black is going to lose his knight on g6. And besides that, the king is going to come under a lot of fire. So black should not do that. Okay, the best move here for black would have been bishop g7. Just keeping a calm head. Now he's ready to play something like knight f4, because his pawn on e5 is once more protected. And what can white do? I mean, if he takes on f5, once again, there's rook takes c2. And if you take, black's going to take here. Once again, the minor pieces are better than the rook, and black should be winning. And if you take with the bishop, this is going to get even worse. Black is going to take on g3, and if you take on g6, guess what? Checkmate. Because your king cannot step to the c-file. So bishop g7 would have been the best move here, and the knight is simply forced to retreat. Now black can play something like rook h8. All his pieces are active. White's pieces are kind of all over the place. They're a bit clumsy. Black can also open up the bishop on the next move, and black should just be winning here. So I think if Duda would have found this move bishop g7, he probably would have went on to win this game. But he played e4, which is still a good move, but things do get a bit messy here. Anyway, so Shahryar takes on f5. Now, you can take with the king, but then white's going to take with this rook, open up this diagonal for the bishop, and black's best option is probably to take on c2, which is what happened in the game. Shahryar recaptured, and I mean here, as I said before, the two minor pieces are better than the rook, but white has a pawn, and the king is a little bit open. Alright, anyway, so Duda played bishop c5, hitting the pawn on f2, but here Shaq came up with a very good move, g4 check. Now best black's option here is h takes g3. Believe it or not, this move is legal, and as we know, en passant is always forced. If white recaptures, I mean, the good thing for white is that he managed to get rid of all the kingside pawns. Once again, black's king is still open, but it should end in a draw. Let's say black plays something like b6 to reinforce the bishop. There's nothing really that both sides can do. But Duda played king to g5. And the question is like whether he was able to adjust to the new situation. He was getting a bit low on the clock, and the game had just gone out of his control. And here Shaq came up with another good move. He played f4 check. Right here black has a decision to make. If he takes on g4, suddenly this knight is hanging. And if you go, let's say, king to f5, hitting both the rooks, white still has rook e to e6 to defend everything. Right, so this is also not easy. And after the move he played in the game, knight takes f4, there's rook e5 check. checking the king and the bishop on c5. So he took the pawn here, and after rook takes c5 he went king to f3. So he must have felt like, okay, my king is pretty active, I have a knight, my rook is behind the passed pawn, which is already on h4. I should be drawing this, right? But things were not that easy. Shaq played the move rook to b4, hitting the pawn. So Duda advanced the pawn, but now all of a sudden rook c3 check. So the king has to keep defending this knight. So went back to g4, but now rook c4, a very, very strong move, hitting the knight with both the rooks, so forcing black to play rook to f8 to defend the knight. But now the rook is no longer behind the passed pawn. So Shaq played rook takes b7, and he's ready to get behind it with rook h7. Now the problem for black is if you go rook h8, white suddenly has rook f7, and you cannot defend this knight on f4. And really the main problem for black is that after, let's say, move like h2, white can take, and king g3, you might be thinking like, hey, I still have this passed pawn here, but white can always go rook f1, give up his rook for the queen, and then take the pawn on a7. And with two connected passers, this is completely winning for white. So Duda played h2 right away, but now came rook h7, getting the rook behind the passed pawn. Black had to go king g3 to defend the pawn. And here a very nice move by Shaq, king to b3. So after king b3, his idea is that, let's say black passes, he wants to give a check to the king, and if the king goes here, then rook c2, and he's picking up the pawn on h2 with both the rooks, and there's simply nothing black can do. The problem for black is if he plays a move like, let's say, rook e8, right, with the idea being that after rook c3, he wants to go king g2, and after rook c2, there is rook e2 to block, right? I mean, looks like a nice idea. But the problem is that as soon as the rook moves to e8, it's no longer defending this knight. So white is simply going to give up one of the rooks here for the pawn, and then take the knight. And even though usually a 2 versus 1 is a draw, look at this king on h2. It's completely cut off. If the king would be on b8, it'd be a draw. But with the king this badly placed, white is simply going to win this endgame. So after king to b3, Duda resigned. A very, very tough loss for Duda. If he had won this game, he would be in the lead with 3 out of 4. But now he's back to 50%. Shahryar jumps to 2.5 out of 4. He's right behind the leader, Vidit. So yeah, very first exciting 4 rounds. And a lot of more action to come after the first rest day, which is going to be tomorrow. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.